This is the story of Amélie, a woman lost between two loves and the shadows of past wounds. Paris, Annecy, and Vienna bear witness to her hesitant steps as she tries to find herself amidst the clash of conflicting emotions. Viktor, the man who has always waited with unwavering loyalty. Luca, a figure who brings warmth but also carries the same deep wounds. In the light of silent European cities, Amélie struggles to separate love, pain, and the haunting shadows that continue to follow her. A journey of the heart full of bitterness, unending longing, and decisions that are never truly easy. The sky over Paris that evening seemed to hang low, holding within it 1,000 untold stories. The grey clouds smothered the city, and a cold wind slipped through the narrow alleyways that connected cobblestone streets to old cafés. By the banks of the river Seine sat a young woman. Her name was Amélie Laurent. She was wrapped in a long cream-colored coat, its hem already damp from the falling rain. On her lap lay an open sketchbook, its pages covered with pencil strokes that shaped shadows of an ancient bridge, bare trees devoid of leaves, and faces that seemed to exist only in her dreams. Amélie let the first raindrops fall, wetting her cheeks. Her eyes, distant and empty, fixed on the slow-moving current of the river, carrying with it dead leaves and bits of wood, drifting toward unknown destinations. She sighed deeply. Paris, they said, was the city of love, but for her this afternoon, it was a city filled with an unyielding loneliness. The sound of footsteps drew near, soft but determined, snapping her from her reverie. The footsteps were heavy, echoing on the wet cobblestones, the click of leather shoes unmistakable. Amélie didn't look up. The rain now came down harder, dancing on the surface of the river, reflecting the newly lit street lamps. The figure stopped beside the bench. A tall man, his black coat soaked on the shoulders, hair dark and tousled against his forehead, with a light beard accentuating his sharp jawline. Luca. Without a word, he sat at the edge of the bench, leaving a respectful distance, as though acknowledging the space Amélie had claimed. Time seemed to freeze. Only the sound of the rain filled the silence. Amélie glanced up briefly, just enough to catch a glimpse of those dark brown eyes. Eyes that held mysteries and burdens. Luca stared at the river without a word, then slowly pulled out a cigarette, lighting it with a calm, steady motion. The smoke swirled with the mist of rain, rising into the cold night air. Minutes passed, marked only by the beating of hearts and the rhythm of nature. Amélie closed her sketchbook, her hands trembling slightly, not just from the cold. There was an odd sensation, a vibration born from the presence of this stranger beside her. It was as if she knew that this evening, her life was about to change in ways she had never imagined. Luca turned slowly, his gaze steady yet penetrating. "This evening is too quiet for one to be alone," he said quietly, his baritone voice nearly drowned by the downpour. Amélie said nothing. She only stared at the river, as though the answer lay within its flow. The Seine continued its course, and with its current, time swept two strangers who knew nothing of one another, into the swirling whirlpool of fate. The rain grew heavier, drenching them both. Yet neither moved. Neither chose to leave. The city's lights began to flicker in the pools of water on the cobblestone streets, creating a moving painting on the old stones. Luca inhaled deeply, then stood. "Sometimes we must let the rain wash away what we don't want to remember," he said, and with that, he turned and walked away, leaving behind the scent of tobacco and an impression that could not be easily erased. Amélie watched his back until he disappeared around the corner. Her eyes, now, were not just wet from the rain. That night, Paris remained alive. The creak of a small boat on the river, the sound of the horse-drawn carriages further down the street, and the faint sound of a violin drifting from an apartment window across the river, all blended into the city's orchestra. Amélie stood up, clutching her sketchbook tightly. The rain dripped from her hair. Slowly, she began walking along the riverbank, as if searching for the shadow of the mysterious man in every dark corner. Her steps halted beneath an old street lamp. She opened her sketchbook again and began to draw. This time, it wasn't a bridge or a bare tree, but the shadow of a man in a black coat, standing alone, staring at the river, as rain fell all around him. The sky over Paris now emptied itself completely. That night, a story quietly began amidst the thousands of untold tales of the old city. A story that would soon pull Amélie into a whirlwind of pain, love, and betrayal. The lights along the Seine flickered faintly, as if they knew a secret that had never been spoken. In the distance, the bells of the church tolled, accompanying Amélie's slow footsteps as she drifted further from the river's edge. That night, Paris was soaked in rain and secrets. The morning greeted Paris shyly, with a thin mist hanging between the old buildings, and the cobbled streets of Montmartre still wet from the rain of the previous night. The sun hesitated to pierce through the thick clouds, as though the city wished to remain hidden in its shadows. Amélie walked slowly, her footsteps nearly silent on the damp stones. In her hand, she tightly clutched the same sketchbook, this time closed, as if unwilling for anyone to glimpse its contents. Every corner of Montmartre seemed to hold a story of its own. The old cafés had started to open their curtains, and the soft aromas of coffee and freshly baked bread wafted gently, tempting anyone who passed by. The morning breeze carried the sounds of small birds fluttering between the lamp posts and slanted rooftops. Amélie paused in front of a small old bookstore. The window was cluttered with faded posters and yellowed papers. Inside, dim lights flickered, casting a soft glow on the wooden shelves stacked with dusty old books. The sound of footsteps approached from behind, familiar footsteps that she had once eagerly awaited. Amélie, the voice stopped her heart for a moment. She turned slowly. There stood a man with dark blonde hair, damp from the morning dew. His blue eyes shone, though there was an unspoken question within them. Viktor Novak. His dark green jacket was a little wrinkled, evidence of his hurried attempt to catch up. "I've been looking for you for so long," Viktor continued, his breath slightly hurried. Amélie offered a small smile, a smile tinged with bitterness. "I just want to be alone, Viktor." They walked side by side, following a narrow path that led uphill to the summit of Montmartre. On either side, old houses with wooden windows cracked open slightly, as if they too were peering at two fragile hearts. "Why are you avoiding me?" Viktor asked, his voice low, fearful of disturbing the quiet morning. Amélie stopped on a stone step, gazing out over Paris, which was slowly waking up. Her eyes welled with unshed tears, but she held herself back. "Because I'm afraid, Viktor. I'm afraid my heart won't be whole for you anymore." Viktor stared at her for a long moment. He reached for her hand, but Amélie gently pulled it away. "I met someone," she whispered, almost inaudible. Viktor's chest tightened. The morning air seemed too thin for him to breathe. He tried to smile, but his face only grew more sorrowful. "Who is he?" Amélie shook her head. "It doesn't matter. I don't even understand it myself. I just feel lost every time I look into his eyes." They sat on the step, letting the morning wind brush their faces. Montmartre in the morning remained enchanting, but to Viktor, no beauty remained but the shadow of the woman beside him. "I came here to ask you to come to Prague with me. I want you to see my city, Charles Bridge, the old castle. I want you to be in my picture, Amélie." Amélie fell silent. She gazed far into the horizon, where the Eiffel Tower faintly appeared through the mist. "Paris holds too many wounds for me. Maybe I need to leave," she said quietly. Viktor looked at her, hope in his eyes. But deep down, he knew that what he would bring to Prague was nothing but the shadow of Amélie. Time passed. The sun began to break through the clouds, illuminating the rooftops of the city. The sound of church bells in the distance echoed, accompanying their steps as they descended the hill. They stopped at a small café at the corner of the street. The café owner, an old man with a thick mustache, greeted them warmly and offered 2 cups of black coffee. Amélie and Viktor sat outside, letting the morning sun warm their faces. "I'll be in Prague next week," Viktor said softly, breaking the long silence. "If you want, I'll wait for you there." Amélie simply nodded. Her coffee remained untouched, still. Montmartre grew quiet again. Only the footsteps of early morning pedestrians could be heard, and the whisper of the wind carried away words that had gone unspoken. That day, Viktor walked home with heavy steps. Amélie stood, watching his back until it disappeared around the corner. Her heart felt tossed about, and Luca's face reappeared in the shadows of her thoughts, as if mocking the indecision that gnawed at her. Meanwhile, the thin clouds slowly cleared from the Paris sky. But in Amélie's heart, the fog only thickened. Her steps once again took her down the narrow streets of Montmartre. Her hand brushed the sketchbook in her bag, yearning to draw for comfort. But no ideas came. No faces appeared. All faces now blended together. Viktor's face. Luca's face. Her own face, which she no longer recognized. She stopped in front of a small antique jewelry shop. Behind the glass, a silver heart-shaped pendant hung from a chain. Amélie stared at it for a long time, until the morning dew fogged up the shop window. Paris that morning seemed like an ordinary city to the thousands of people passing through it. But to Amélie, every corner now felt like a labyrinth, a maze that led her further astray. And within that labyrinth, she was losing herself. Florence greeted Amélie with the scent of damp stone and the fragrance of flowers blooming in the windows of old houses. The sky at dusk was painted with shades of orange and purple, enveloping the ancient city as if it were frozen in time. Along the narrow streets, flanked by stone buildings, the sounds of tourists' footsteps blended with the bells of the church, ringing to mark the end of the day. Amélie stood on the old Ponte Vecchio. The Arno River flowed beneath her, calm, reflecting the soft light of the evening sky and the shadows of the ancient buildings that stood proudly on either side. In her hand, she held her sketchbook, but the pages remained empty. Her gaze stretched far beyond the bridge, where the jewelry vendors were closing their small stalls, preparing to end their day. In the stillness of her heart, the familiar voice returned. A voice that had started to grow increasingly familiar in both her ears and her heart. "Did you come here alone?" Luca Bianchi stood beside her. His dark curly hair was tousled by the evening breeze, and his dark coat seemed to merge with the shadows of dusk that embraced the city. His eyes, steady and calm, looked at Amélie, not as a man looks at a stranger, but with a gaze as though he had known her for a long time, as though he understood how fragile she truly was. Amélie offered a faint smile. "I was invited for an exhibition. But I feel like I came here for more than just that." Luca gazed at the river, as if reading the flow of the water that carried with it secrets and memories. Florence is a city for those who seek, but more often than not, they get lost. The evening lingered above Ponte Vecchio. People began to leave the bridge, leaving the two of them alone in the quiet beauty and sorrow of the moment. "Do you often come here?" Amélie asked softly, her voice almost drowned by the breeze that tousled her hair. Luca nodded. "Whenever I lose my way. This bridge always reminds me that sometimes what's lost need not be sought." Amélie closed her eyes for a moment, letting those words sink deep into her heart. The evening wind carried with it the scent of climbing flowers from the balconies of houses, a fragrance that, for some reason, made her chest tighten. They walked slowly along the bridge, their footsteps echoing between the old stones, accompanied by the ripple of the river below. "What did you paint today?" Luca asked, breaking the silence that had begun to settle between them. Amélie opened her sketchbook to reveal the empty pages. "I couldn't bring myself to draw. Every time I lift the pencil, the shadow of someone's face appears, and my hand stops." Luca halted his steps. His eyes were fixed on Amélie's face, bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. "And do you wish that face would disappear?" Amélie didn't answer. Only a long, deep breath escaped her lips. The sky began to fade, as dusk slowly turned into night. The yellow lamps along the bridge flickered on, casting their reflections onto the surface of the river. They reached the end of the bridge, at a corner rarely frequented by others. There, Luca pulled a small bottle of wine from inside his coat. "Stay with me here for a while. Florence is not always as beautiful as people imagine. Sometimes, you need a little wine to understand its pain." For the first time that evening, Amélie smiled, then nodded. They sat on the cold stone floor, letting the night's chill seep through their coats. Luca poured wine into 2 small glasses and handed one to Amélie. "What are we to toast to?" Amélie asked. Luca raised his glass. "To the wounds that keep us human." They drank the wine slowly, its warmth offering little comfort against the cold that crept between their hearts. In the distance, the sound of a violin floated toward them. An old street musician played a melancholy tune, a song of lost love in the old city. The notes drifted with the wind, merging with the light from the lamps and the whispers of the night. Amélie looked at Luca. His face seemed to grow deeper under the light of the lamps. The lines of his jaw, his eyes full of stories, and the faint smile that rarely left his lips. The wound in Amélie's heart felt more real than ever. A wound because her heart was slowly beginning to falter. A wound because she knew someone was waiting for her in another city. Luca looked back. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The river ceased to flow, the wind stopped blowing, and only the sound of their heartbeats could be heard in the silence. "I'm afraid of nights like this," Amélie whispered. "Why?" Luca asked softly. "Because nights like this make me want to forget everything." Luca said nothing. He only stared, as if wanting to say that he, too, was afraid. But he knew that words would never be enough to hold back what was inevitable. Time passed. The night wind carried away the sound of the violin, and the city began to fall asleep in its darkness. They stood up. Without a word, without a promise. Just two shadows walking side by side in an old city, on a bridge that had borne witness to too many loves and farewells. When they parted at the street corner, Amélie looked back for the last time. Luca was no longer looking at her. Only his back slowly disappearing into the dark night. And in the heart of that old city, Amélie knew that her heart was no longer whole. Prague greeted Amélie with a mist that hung low over the old city. On that cold morning, the cobblestone streets were still wet from a previous night's rain, and the Vltava river flowed calmly beneath the Charles Bridge, carrying the reflections of old towers and neatly arranged red rooftops. The air carried the scent of wet wood and the warm aroma of bread from small bakeries in the alleyways. Amélie walked slowly among the tourists, their cameras flashing. Occasionally, she looked up to admire the stone statues lined along the bridge. Her heart felt heavy, as if every step added to the burden she carried from Paris. At the end of the bridge, a man stood waiting for her. Viktor Novak, dressed in a brown jacket, an old camera hanging from his neck, smiled to greet her. His smile was genuine, but in his eyes, there was an unease that could not be hidden. "You came," he said softly, as though still in disbelief. Amélie returned the smile, though it was a difficult one. "I promised I would come." They walked across the bridge. Viktor stopped now and then, taking pictures of the clearing sky, the bridge's reflection in the water, and Amélie's face as she gazed vacantly at the river. "I want to capture you here," Viktor said, pulling out his camera. "In a place that always makes me feel like I'm coming home." Amélie stood beneath the stone arch, silent. The morning breeze tousled her hair, deepening the sadness in her expression. The camera clicked, capturing a face full of secrets. "Every time I come here," Viktor continued, "I imagine you standing on this bridge waiting for me." Amélie stared at him. "I don't know what I'm waiting for anymore, Viktor." The sounds of the city murmured around them, the church bells ringing, the clip-clop of hooves from a tourist carriage, and the laughter of children in a nearby park. But among all that noise, only the sound of their hearts seemed to echo the loudest. They walked toward the old castle, navigating the narrow alleys with moss-covered stone walls. Viktor spoke of his childhood, the days he used to run through these streets, and how his mother would always wait for him at the window of their small house on the hill. "Prague always reminds me of what I've lost," he said, his voice hoarse. Amélie stopped walking. "I feel lost too, Viktor. But the one I've lost is still in front of me." Viktor looked at her deeply. "Who is he, Amélie?" Amélie shook her head softly. "I don't want you to hate him. And I don't want you to hate me." They arrived at the castle courtyard. From there, Prague stretched out before them, its red rooftops glowing in the sunlight that had finally broken through the clouds. The river glittered in the distance, and the Charles Bridge appeared as a dark line dividing the city. They sat on the stone steps, letting the cold wind brush their faces. Viktor pulled a photo from his pocket. It was a picture of Amélie in Montmartre, taken secretly the last time they were together in Paris. "I carry this every day," he said, "so I don't feel like I've completely lost you." Amélie gazed at the photo, her head lowering. Tears flowed, uncontrollable. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Viktor took her hand in his. Warm. Strong. But the grip could not hold Amélie's heart, which was growing farther away. The day passed. They wandered the old city, greeting the flower vendors at the small market, tasting warm bread at a street-side cafe, and sitting for long stretches on wooden benches in the park. Yet throughout it all, something remained unsettled in their hearts. At an old church, Amélie stopped. She stared at the large wooden doors, the faint outline of an ancient cross carved above, nearly faded by time. "I want to go in," she said. Inside, the church was silent. Only the dim light from the stained glass windows illuminated the vast space. Amélie walked to the altar, knelt, and closed her eyes. Viktor stood behind her, watching the back of the woman he had always loved, but had never truly been able to possess. Night began to fall as they exited the church. The city's lamps flickered on, lighting the quiet streets. A light drizzle began to fall, adding a chill that seeped to the bones. They stopped once again on the bridge. Amélie gazed at the flowing water, as if hoping the current would carry away all that weighed on her heart. "I don't want to lose you," Viktor said finally. Amélie turned to him. The rain mixed with her tears on her face. "You've already lost me, Viktor. Even before I knew I was lost." They stood there for a long while, letting the night wrap them in silence. Then, without a word, Amélie turned and walked away, heading down the darkened street toward the small hotel in the corner of the city. Viktor remained there, watching the water of the river now darkened by the night. And that night, Prague became the witness to a wound that would never truly heal. Paris greeted Amélie with a different face this time. The night descended with a biting cold wind, carrying the distant murmurs of streets that never truly sleep. The city lights flickered in the distance, and the Eiffel Tower stood proudly, illuminated by a yellow light that peeked shyly through a thin mist. Amélie stood on the small balcony of her apartment. The window behind her was open, letting the white curtains gently flutter in the night wind. Her eyes stared blankly at the city lights, trying to find meaning in the shimmering lights. Her hands gripped the balcony railing tightly, as if trying to ensure that she was still real, still here. Footsteps echoed from within the apartment, slow, but heavy with burden. Luca appeared at the door, his face somber, his eyes dark. He paused for a moment, watching Amélie's back, then approached her slowly. "Why did you call me tonight?" Luca asked, his voice deep, almost like a whisper. Amélie didn't turn around. "I'm tired, Luca. Tired of all of this." The night wind carried the sounds of the city to that small balcony. The hum of distant cars, drunken laughter from the bar on the corner, and the haunting sound of a violin played by a busker whose origin remained unknown. Luca stood beside Amélie. "Tired of what?" "Of us." Amélie let out a long sigh. Her eyes welled up with tears, but she held them back. "Tired of myself. Of everything I feel. Of the wounds that never stop." Luca closed his eyes, his hands clenched at his sides. "Then let me go. If I'm the wound, I'll disappear from your life." Those words pierced Amélie's heart. She turned, gazing into Luca's eyes, now full of shadows of pain. "It's not that simple, Luca. If I could hate, everything would be easier." Their voices fractured into whispers, carried away by the wind. The white curtains danced on, silently witnessing a struggle that no longer needed loud words. Their wounds were too deep to be spoken of in mere phrases. "I don't know what to do anymore," Luca said, his voice breaking. "Every time I try to get closer, you pull away. And when I step back, you call me back." Amélie turned her face, looking at the moon rising in the sky. "Because I'm afraid of being alone, but I'm also afraid of being with you." They stood in silence for a long while. Only the sound of their hearts seemed to echo in the stillness of the night. Luca gently touched Amélie's hand, slowly, carefully. "You don't have to be afraid of me." Amélie pulled her hand away slowly. "I'm not afraid of you, Luca. I'm afraid of myself. Of my heart that's weak." The night grew later. The wind grew stronger, bringing with it a cold that seeped through their coats. Luca stepped back, moving into the apartment. "I have to go," he said softly, "before I fall deeper into the same wound." Amélie watched his back. "Don't leave tonight." Luca stopped. His shoulders trembled, holding back emotions that could not be expressed. "Why? So we can hurt each other again tomorrow." Amélie cried without a sound. Her tears fell, soaking her cheeks, mingling with the cold of the night. "So I don't feel empty tonight." Luca turned back. His steps were heavy, but he came closer. They stood facing each other, so close yet separated by an invisible wall. Without words, without promises, they allowed time to stop on that silent balcony. The city of Paris continued to live, but their hearts were dead in the silence. That night, they stood until the early hours, letting the cold envelop them. Words were no longer necessary. The wounds had spoken enough. And as morning approached, only the imprint of Luca's footsteps remained on the wooden floor of the apartment. Amélie stayed on the balcony, staring blankly at the sun rising over the eastern horizon. Paris woke again, but on that small balcony, only silence remained. Annecy greeted Amélie with a silence that was suffocating. The small town by the lake was almost completely still that morning. The fog hung low, hiding the mountains in the distance, and the surface of the lake mirrored the gray sky that seemed to hover above her head. Amélie walked slowly along the lakeshore, her steps deliberate, as if each imprint on the ground was a weight she needed to feel deeply. Her leather shoes were wet with the dew that clung to the grass. The cold wind blew softly, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine wood. She stopped at an old wooden dock. From there, the lake stretched wide still, almost without a ripple. In the distance, small boats bobbed lazily, as though they too had become immersed in the quiet of the morning. Amélie exhaled deeply, reaching into the pocket of her coat to pull out a crumpled letter. A letter from Viktor. His words were simple, but filled with pain. I have been waiting for you, always waiting for you. But I don't know if you will come, or if it's just your shadow you send to me. Amélie squeezed the letter slowly in her hands. Her tears fell silently, blending with the falling rain. Footsteps approached from behind. Slowly, but enough to snap her out of her thoughts. An old woman came closer, carrying a basket of wildflowers. Her face was wrinkled, but her smile was warm. Young lady, it's too quiet this morning for you to cry alone, she said gently. Amélie forced a bitter smile, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. I'm just tired, madam. The old woman sat next to her, placing her basket of flowers on the dock. Annecy has always been a place for those who wish to heal, but sometimes, wounds don't heal just by leaving. Amélie gazed at the lake, her eyes empty. I've tried to run away from myself. But it turns out, I'm always everywhere. The rain began to fall, light drops that danced on the surface of the lake. The old woman stood, reaching for her basket of flowers. Don't let this rain just wet your body. Let it also cleanse your heart. Amélie nodded slowly. The woman left, her footsteps disappearing into the fog. Amélie remained on the dock. The rain grew heavier, soaking her hair, her coat, her shoes. But she didn't move. Viktor's face appeared in her mind. His smile, the look in his eyes, his voice calling her name in Prague. Then came Luca's shadow. His dark eyes full of secrets, his baritone voice that always resonated, the quiet of his steps as he left her apartment balcony. Her heart felt torn. The strong wind blew the rain against her face. Lake Annecy now rippled with small waves, the sky darkening, and the town seemed to fall silent under an unseen wound. Amélie walked back to her small inn by the lake. The hallways were empty, only the sound of rain on the roof and the occasional creak of old windows could be heard. In her small room, she sat by the window, staring out at the rain that poured over the town. The wooden table in front of her was empty, except for a scrap of paper and a pencil. She wanted to draw, but again, her hand stopped. There was no face she could sketch without making her heart ache. The night fell quickly. The lights of the small town flickered on, adding to the sadness that had already settled deep within her. The rain continued, now a soft drizzle that danced on the windowpane. Amélie opened the window, letting the night air in. The cold bit at her, but she didn't care. She wanted to feel something. Anything, other than emptiness. In the distance, the bells of the old church tolled. The sound was faint, as if it came from another world. Amélie whispered Viktor's name, then Luca's. Her chest tightened. That night, she let the rain soak the wooden floor of her room, soak Viktor's letter lying on the table, and soak her heart that had long been drenched in wounds. Outside, Lake Annecy remained still. But inside Amélie's heart, the storm raged on. The rain had stopped in Annecy, leaving behind the earthy scent of wet ground mixed with the fragrance of pine and morning dew. The grey sky still hung low over the small town, as if reluctant to give way to the sun. By the lake, the water mirrored the pale silhouettes of the mountains, which faintly emerged from the remnants of fog. Amélie sat at the small desk in her room. In front of her, a piece of paper lay stretched out empty, waiting to be filled with words. Her hands trembled as she held the pen. Each stroke felt heavy, as if every word written added more weight to her chest. She began to write, letter by letter, sentence by sentence, to someone whose heart she had continuously wounded. Viktor, I am no longer worthy of your waiting. I have gone too far, sunk too deep. It's no one's fault. It's just my heart, unable to be honest with anyone, not even with myself. The pen paused. Tears fell onto the paper, smearing the ink she had just written. Amélie took a deep breath, trying to suppress the sobs that surged from her chest. Outside, small birds began chirping, breaking the silence of the morning. But the sound was not enough to dispel the loneliness that surrounded Amélie. She slowly folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. Her hand lingered on the envelope, as if she hoped the warmth of her palm could erase the coldness of the words inside. That morning, she walked to the post office in the small square of Annecy. The streets were still wet, gleaming in the sunlight that began to break through the clouds. Along the streets, townsfolk were busy opening windows, sweeping their porches, beginning their new day. But for Amélie, that morning did not bring a new beginning. That morning was the end. In the old post office, with its stone walls beginning to gather moss, Amélie stood for a long while in front of the mailbox. Her hand extended, but the envelope remained tightly gripped. Her heart waged a battle. Letting go of the letter meant admitting that everything was over. But holding on to it meant continuing to deceive herself and Viktor. Finally, she slowly slid the envelope inside. As it disappeared into the narrow slit of the mailbox, it felt as though a piece of her soul disappeared with it. She walked back to the lakeshore. The wind blew gently, tousling her hair, lifting the thin strands that covered her face. On the old wooden dock, she stood, staring at the still water. The sound of footsteps approached. The steps were familiar, though she hadn't heard them in so long. Luca. The man stood not far from her. His face was weary, his eyes dim, his curly hair damp from the morning dew. "I've been looking for you," he said. Amélie turned and gazed at him deeply. "Why did you come?" Luca smiled bitterly. "Because I can no longer wait for you to come to me." They stood facing each other, separated only by the cold air and the wounds that hung between them. "I sent a letter to Viktor this morning," Amélie said. "I want to end all these lies." Luca looked at the lake, then turned back to Amélie. "And after that, what do you expect?" Amélie shook her head slowly. "I don't expect anything anymore. I just want to stop hurting." The morning wind blew the fog over the lake. The sun now appeared brighter, casting golden light onto the surface of the water. Luca moved closer, so close that Amélie could feel the warmth of his breath. "Then let me stop waiting. Let me be by your side without expecting anything." Amélie closed her eyes. Tears flowed, soaking her cheeks. The wound in her heart felt even deeper. "Luca, you are too good to be used as an escape." Luca sighed deeply. "I never felt good. I just fell too deep for you." They stood there for a long while, allowing time to stop. Only the sound of water and the whisper of the wind accompanied them. Luca reached out his hand, taking Amélie's cold hand in his. For a moment, Amélie didn't pull away. She let his warmth envelop her, though she knew it wouldn't last. In the distance, the bells of the church tolled. The sound cut through the morning, reminding them that time continued to move forward, even though their hearts seemed stuck in the same place. They walked along the lakeshore, their steps slow, as if they didn't want the day to end. But deep in Amélie's heart, she knew that nothing could truly be held onto. The wounds had already run too deep, and no words could heal them. That night, in her small room, Amélie sat by the window, watching the stars begin to appear in the dark sky. The letter to Viktor had already vanished in its journey. Luca had returned to his inn, leaving behind a silence that lingered. Lake Annecy reflected the moonlight. Calm. Silent. Hiding the ripples beneath its surface. Just like her heart, which appeared calm but raged within. That night, Amélie wrote again. Not a letter to anyone. Just words she had never dared to say. Words she let remain trapped in the pages of her sketchbook. "If I could choose, I would have never known love. Because love brought me to wounds that never heal." Paris in the fall is a city that looks beautiful from the outside, but hides emptiness in every corner. Yellow and brown leaves fall onto the sidewalks, covering the old stone streets, which are wet from the drizzle that began in the afternoon. The gray sky seems to hang low over the rooftops, pressing the city with an invisible sadness. Amélie walked alone down Rue de Martyrs. Her steps were slow, as if every footfall added weight to the burden in her heart. The cold wind seeped through the gaps in her coat, piercing her bones. In her hand, she gripped her sketchbook, which had long been empty. The small shops began closing. The streetlights flickered on, casting dim yellow light on the puddles that reflected the glow. The aroma of coffee and freshly baked bread from the cafes still open lingered faintly, but it wasn't enough to chase away the cold and the silence that embraced Amélie. She stopped in front of an art gallery. Behind the glass, paintings in golden frames hung neatly. But none of them captured her attention. Instead, her eyes were drawn to her reflection in the glass. A pale face, swollen eyes, and lips that could no longer smile. Footsteps approached. Amélie didn't need to look back to know who it was. The sound of those footsteps was too familiar, too often present in her dreams. Amélie. Viktor stood beside her. His face was tired, his eyes filled with 1,000 unspoken questions. "You came," Amélie whispered. "I can't wait any longer," Viktor answered softly. "I came to take you, or at least take your heart that's lost." Amélie looked at him, their eyes meeting in silence. The rain started to fall again, soaking their hair and faces. But neither of them moved to shelter. "I sent you a letter," Amélie said. Viktor nodded. "I know. But that letter never reached me. All that arrived was the longing you never spoke." The rain grew heavier. People ran for shelter, but they stayed there, letting the rain witness the wounds that had never healed. "I tried to leave you, Viktor. Over and over again. But the further I went, the closer your shadow became." Viktor wiped the raindrops from Amélie's face, as if that could also wipe away the tears that were invisible to him. "And I never stopped looking for you, in every corner of this city, in every night that never ends." They walked together under the rain. No umbrella, no destination. Just two hearts trying to find each other amid the raindrops that soaked the earth. They reached the banks of the Seine. The river flowed calmly, reflecting the dim streetlights. The rain made the water ripple slightly, as if the river itself could feel the restlessness in their hearts. Viktor looked at Amélie. "If I ask you to come with me tonight, would you go?" Amélie lowered her gaze. Her hands trembled, unable to grasp the hope that had just been spoken. "I don't know, Viktor. My heart is too shattered. I'm afraid I'll only hurt you again." Viktor smiled bitterly. "I'm not afraid of the wounds. I'm only afraid of losing you." They stood there for a long time. The rain finally stopped, leaving mist in the air and the scent of wet earth rising. In the distance, the sound of a violin played by a street musician reached their ears. An old tune, about lost love that never returned. The notes seeped into their hearts, stirring the wounds that had long since dried. Amélie closed her eyes. In her mind, Luca's face appeared, the look in his eyes that night in Annecy, the warmth of his hand, and the words he never spoke. Viktor took Amélie's hand. "You don't have to choose tonight. But don't let your heart keep getting lost." Amélie looked at him. "I want to stop being hurt. But I don't know how." They continued walking, along the banks of the Seine, letting the night be theirs. Paris fell silent, but in their hearts, that night never truly ended. As dawn began to peek over the eastern horizon, they parted at a street corner. No promises, no words, only the remnants of rain in their hair and the wounds in their hearts that would never heal. And in the Paris sky, the morning was born without a clear hope. The night train carried Amélie far from Paris. Far from the dim lights of the city, far from the cobbled streets full of memories. In the old gently swaying carriage, she sat staring out of the dark window, where her reflection stared back, faintly, as though accusing her. Vienna welcomed her with a freezing morning. The silvery white sky hung low over the old city. A light dusting of snow covered the rooftops, making everything look like an old silent painting. The cold wind blew from the direction of the Danube, cutting through the thick coat that wrapped around Amélie's body. She walked slowly on the slippery sidewalk, moving through empty streets toward a small hotel near Stephansplatz. The bells of the cathedral rang softly, their sound slipping through the morning fog, touching a heart that had been frozen for too long. In her small room, Amélie stood at the window. From there, the cathedral spire rose high, its tip nearly disappearing into the clouds. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass, letting the freezing air creep across her skin. In silence, Amélie opened her sketchbook. Her hand trembled as the pencil danced across the paper. The lines of a face began to form. Eyes. A faint smile. The curve of a jaw. But as soon as half the face was drawn, her hand stopped. She couldn't. The face looked too much like Viktor's. Or Luca's. Or the shadow that had haunted her without a name. Amélie walked out, letting the snow cling to her hair, shoulders, and the swollen rims of her eyes. Vienna was so quiet. The only sound was the crunching of snow beneath her shoes. She entered a small old café, with dark wooden tables and large foggy windows. In the corner of the room, an old man played the piano, classical melodies that lingered, like a heart that could never speak its truth. Amélie sat by the window. Outside, the snow fell harder, obscuring the world. The door to the café opened. The cold wind blew in, along with a guest she had long known. Luca. His face was weary, his eyes red from a sleepless night, yet they still radiated a light that always made Amélie unable to look too long. Luca walked over and sat across from her. No words were spoken. Only the gaze in their eyes spoke volumes. "I didn't know you were here," Amélie finally said. "I always know where you go," Luca whispered. "Because I know the direction of your heart better than the direction of your steps." They fell silent, letting the piano's sound fill the space between them. "Why did you come, Luca?" Amélie asked, her voice barely audible. Luca looked at her, his eyes full of pain. "To say goodbye, if that's what you need. Or to stay here, if that's what you want." Amélie lowered her gaze. Tears fell, wetting the table. "I don't know what I need anymore, Luca. I don't even know who I am." The old pianist stopped playing. Silence hung thick. Only the beating of their hearts could be heard in the stillness. Luca touched Amélie's hand. "You don't have to answer tonight. But don't let time keep freezing your heart." Outside, the snow stopped. The sky began to clear, the winter sun peeking out shyly, casting silver light on the city's rooftops. They walked outside. Vienna turned white beneath the morning light. The streets were empty, with only their footprints left in the snow. By the Danube, they stopped. The river flowed gently, splitting the old city, which now seemed like another world. Luca stared at the water. "You always try to run from the pain, Amélie. But the pain always follows you wherever you go." Amélie looked at the river, her voice trembling. "I want to leave it all here. All the pain, all the memories." Luca smiled sadly. "If that were possible, I would have thrown away my heart long ago." They stood there for a long time. The wind carried the cold, whispering the past, carrying the unending longing. And as the night descended on Vienna, they remained at the river's edge, letting time freeze around them. Dawn slowly descended upon Vienna, casting the city in a pale light that shyly slipped between the old buildings and church spires. The snow that had fallen overnight now blanketed everything in pure white, hiding the wounds in the cobblestone streets. Amélie's footsteps left deep impressions in the snow, as if each step was an unanswered question. That morning, she walked toward Schönbrunn, the grand palace standing silently at the edge of the city. In winter, its vast gardens were nothing but a white expanse, the bare trees' branches reaching out like hands pleading to the sky. At the grand gate, Amélie stopped. The sky above the palace was a pale blue, the sun hanging dimly between thin clouds. Everything felt distant, silent, as if the world was holding its breath. Amélie walked along the path in the garden, where old iron benches were half covered in snow. She sat on one, her hand gripping the worn sketchbook, her fingers frozen by the cold. She began to draw. Line after line. Face after face. No longer was there hesitation. No longer did her hand stop in the middle of a stroke. Viktor's face. Luca's face. Her own face, between them. All of them mixed together in imperfect but honest lines. Tears fell onto the paper, but she let them. This time, she didn't want to erase them. The wound was too deep to hide anymore. Footsteps approached. Heavy. Steady. Viktor. He stood before Amélie. His face was tired, his eyes dim but warm. "I knew I would find you here." Amélie looked at him, no longer looking down, no longer running. "I don't want to run anymore, Viktor." Viktor sat beside her, allowing the smallest of distances to separate them. "And I don't want to chase you anymore. I just want to be beside you, wherever your heart goes." Another step. Luca appeared from the opposite direction. His face was swollen, but his eyes still burned with the same fire. A wound that never healed. I came because I couldn't let you face this alone, he said. 3 hearts. 3 souls. 1 shared wound. Amélie stood, looking at them both. Snow began to fall again, gently, dancing in the air, covering the world with fresh white. I love both of you, Amélie whispered. But I love the part of myself that's lost between you both. Viktor and Luca stood still. Those words were the truth they had never heard, but always known. Amélie walked away, leaving new footprints in the still fresh snow. At the top of the stone stairs of the palace, she stopped and looked out over the city of Vienna, now blanketed in white below her. Let me learn to stand on my own, she whispered to the wind. Viktor looked at Luca. Luca looked at Viktor. No words. No anger. No resentment. Just a wound they had finally shared. The snow began to fall heavier. The world turned white. And between shadows and light, Amélie slowly disappeared, no longer bound, no longer chased, no longer chasing. Time stopped in the palace garden. And everything stood still in the peace that had long been sought. And so Amélie's journey ended, not by anyone's side, but in a place where she finally found herself. Her footsteps were left in silent cities, in the snow that covered wounds, in the ripples of water that held secrets. Between light and shadow, that complicated love never truly vanished, it merely transformed into a memory that quietly lived in the corners of her heart. The night descended once more, and the world continued to turn, carrying everything that ever was as part of a time that would never return.